This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Riding a motorcycle is inherently dangerous. If riders from the early days of two-wheeled motoring could experience even what we consider a beginner bike today, they would soil their britches. Even in the early days, as motorcycles got faster and more powerful, and as protective gear was entirely non-existent, there shouldn't have been any need to add any more dangerous elements to this whole two-wheeled formula. But in 1911, the people behind the famous Luna amusement park on Coney Island debuted a radical new attraction that would soon take the American carnival scene by storm, lasting for decades, evolving to become even more dangerous, eventually becoming known as the Wall of Death. This is the story of how this mad feat of motorcycle daring was born, and how it burned itself into American culture, and how it even lives on today. Do you know what else you couldn't do in 1911? Build yourself a website. Yeah, you'd probably have to hire somebody at that point. Now, for me, with 3 YouTube channels and a book out, I've wanted a website as really a home base for everything, one site that ties the whole BART brand together, so I've been using Squarespace to make it happen. This is an all-in-one website platform builder that makes it easy for you to build and grow your online presence, whether you're starting something new or scaling something that you've already built. For me, the best part is just how easy it is to make something that looks clean and professional without needing to know a single line of code. The templates already look great, but they are highly customizable to make it fit your brand. It's all modern and minimal and simple to navigate. I've also been using Squarespace's e-commerce tools to sell my book, and it's really seamless. Payments are secure. You can manage the store. You can manage your content. The site updates all from one dashboard, plus the built-in SEO tools help people find my content when they search for cars, motorcycles, or watches. So I'm not just relying on YouTube's algorithm, which is really awesome. If you've been thinking about starting your own project, a site, a store, even just a blog, head to squarespace.com/BART for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use my code BART to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring the channel and for sponsoring this video. All right, let's jump back in. The turn of the century was really a time of unprecedented competition in America, of course in terms of industry, but also in the realm of entertainment. Baseball was already on its way to becoming America's pastime, with packed-out stadiums all over the country, but sports like boxing and horse racing, and specifically bicycle racing, were really growing in popularity. Cycle racing in particular had begun taking place on special oval tracks known as velodromes, with their steep embankments similar to board track racing. Thrill seekers working for traveling carnivals really latched onto this idea and began building smaller, more compact versions of the velodromes for the amusement of crowds, known as cycle whirls or whirls of death. These early stunt bulls would help establish both the physical architecture and also just the cultural DNA of what would later evolve into skate park bowls, half pipes, and also freestyle stunt riding. But that's a whole nother story. Because another development was taking shape around this time, based around an even wilder idea. What if we made the same kind of stunt bulls, but instead of bicycles, we used motorcycles? No doubt these early cycle stunt bulls influenced the later Motordrome and Wall of Death, but in many ways it came to exist independently. Amusement parks of this era were constantly trying to one-up one another, chasing bigger thrills and bolder feats of daring. Rides as we really know them weren't the main attractions at amusement parks. Rather, it was these shows and these kind of circus acts. By 1909, a new circular motor stadium had been constructed at Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, a place where both motorcycles and small racing cars could share the track. Known locally as the Manhattan Beach Motordrome, it mimicked the European velodromes in design, but with wooden planks banked up to nearly 85 degrees, steep enough to make gravity seem optional. Professional board track racing was really gaining notoriety for its danger and also mounting death toll. 2 years after the construction of Manhattan Beach's Motordrome, that idea migrated over to Coney Island, the undisputed capital of American amusement. Here, a new structure called the Automobile Racetrack, later dubbed the Motordrome, was built in the Dreamland section of the park. Its circular form was radical, 65 feet across at the base and rising to 85 feet at the rim. Crowds thrilled by the sight of daredevils like Crazy Harry Curran, a driver who survived in a spectacular crash shortly after the attraction opened in May of 1911 and went on to become the show's star. Spectators packed in to watch both cars and motorcycles scale the near vertical banking suspended by centrifugal force just feet away from the audience. Within a year, 1912, Abraham Swartz and Albert Turpin opened a competing motordrome nearby, also at Dreamland, but this one was more focused on motorcycles, which really were capturing the public more than cars, at least for this event. These early dromes were crude but spectacular. Spectators would climb to the upper rim to peer straight down at riders circling below, engines bellowing, tires clawing for grip on the pine boards. By 1913 and 1914, this formula was evolving. Traveling versions began appearing across the country, portable wooden drums that could be disassembled and hauled by train. Companies like Joy Amusement and the ambitious Frank Hatch were building and touring their own dromes, each slightly different in construction, but all designed to thrill onlookers as riders defied the laws of motion. Hatch's early versions were slanted, but in Georgia, two builders were hammering together something entirely new, a motordrome with vertical walls. This was really the true evolutionary step, transforming a racetrack into a spectacle of pure defiance. Here, riders would be orbiting a cylinder, basically, rather than, any semblance of a track. Within just a few years, this simple idea had evolved into one of the most electrifying traveling shows in America. One of the reasons motordromes took off as attractions versus velodromes has to do also with the viewing experience. These were set up intentionally so that everyone watching could see all the action, whereas velodromes, they were only really visible, for the most part, through these planks of wood. Now, if you know anything about this story, you've probably heard the term wall of death. But up to this point, no motordrome featured an entirely vertical wall. That is, until 1915, one example appeared being promoted as the human silo, with riders circling these even more dangerous, entirely perpendicular versions. This wall of death would soon replace the earlier motordromes entirely. Various names would be used, from death trap to silodrome, but the idea was always the same. Riders would loop around entirely horizontal, coming within inches of spectators and also performing death-defying tricks, riding without hands, standing on the pegs, and often the best of these riders were former racers. Surprisingly, fans were rarely injured or killed by the Wall of Death attraction. It was much more common for riders to crash, even into each other, fatally. Perhaps the most notable example happened when veteran rider Earl Kettering was performing in the motordrome of the Johnny J. Jones Exposition in Greenville, South Carolina. During the show's finale, Kettering took part in a stunt that required him to ride in the opposite direction of fellow daredevil Edward Kesterson. The two men went to circle the wall in opposite directions, but for reasons still unknown, Kesterson descended into Kettering's path and the two collided violently. Their motorcycles slammed together mid-wall before crashing to the bottom in front of a horrified audience. Kesterson survived with several fractured ribs and a concussion, but Earl Kettering, aged 50 and well known throughout the motordrome circuit, suffered severe head injuries and died 6 days later, and his death really shook the carnival riding community. As with many forms of early riding, women riders weren't just novelties in the motordromes. As far back as 1914, people like Margaret Gast and Olive Hager stunned audiences with their skill and nerve. These pioneering women earned titles like Mile-a-Minute Girls and Speed Queens and Danger Dames, mastering the same death-defying tricks as their male counterparts, while adding a sense of flair and showmanship. Some even formed all-female troops, riding daily alongside lions or bears in feats of daring that really became legend. More on lions and bears in a minute. Their legacy carried through later generations of women, like Samantha Morgan, known as the Queen of the Wall of Death, who toured the U.S. well into the 80s, inspiring countless riders who followed, though sadly many of their names have been lost to history. Now, perhaps you're already asking yourself this question: What were the best kinds of motorcycles for such riding? Was it just random? Were they customized? Well, unsurprisingly, the iconic Indian Scout upon its release really proved to be the motorcycle of choice. When the Indian Scout debuted in 1920, it arrived really at the perfect moment. The post-war carnival circuit was booming, and riders needed a bike that was compact, light, and tough enough to handle the endless vibration and stress of the motordrome's vertical planks. The Scout was all of those things. Its low center of gravity, short wheelbase, and reliable 37 cubic inch V twin engine gave it really an ideal balance between stability and maneuverability, which would really be critical when you're moving sideways at 30 miles per hour with nothing but centrifugal force keeping you from falling. Other motorcycle manufacturers, of course, Harley-Davidson, Excelsior, they had machines that were capable, but none were so perfectly suited to the wall as the Scout. As motordromes would change hands, and they often did, the motorcycles were usually sold along with the wooden structure itself. Riders who weren't already familiar with Indians' peculiar control layout had to adapt quickly. The Scout, like all Indians, had left-hand throttle, for example. So mastering this bike was almost part of mastering the wall itself. And if you couldn't do that, you would be stuck with probably a heavier, less predictable machine. But the riders who conquered the Scout tended to stay loyal for life, and that reputation alone helped cement its dominance. Even the earliest generation of these bikes, with rigid frames, leaf spring front forks, primitive oil systems, they were the backbone of the Wall of Death for decades. Their simplicity was key, fewer parts meant fewer things to break. Long after Indian ceased production, these Scouts still kept circling the motordromes of America well into the 70s and even the 80s. The Indian Scout was really a cultural symbol of the Wall of Death itself. From county fairgrounds, traveling sideshows, its distinct silhouette and barking exhaust became really integral to the act. While other motorcycles came and went, it was the Scout that endured, and it earned its place as really an equally great performer alongside all the riders. By the mid-20s, the Wall of Death had grown so familiar that showmen began seeking even wilder ways to keep crowds on edge. The most audacious of all these came when operators started adding lions and bears to the act. This idea was simple but also pretty horrifying. A rider would circle the wall while a lion paced below on the track. The implication was that if they made a single mistake, they would die. Now, the earliest known example appeared in Billboard magazine in 1926, describing a lion used in the Martin and Cast Show's motordrome. Soon others followed, among them Earl Pardee Bray, who became famous for training a lion to ride in his sidecar. The ultimate evolution of the stunt came in 1933, when Marst and Cast unveiled their Race for Life attraction at the Century of Progress exposition in Chicago, a vast 40-foot motordrome with a lion, dubbed Fearless Kenny, racing riders at 50 miles per hour. Nothing like this would really ever be seen again. It was pretty crazy. By the late 30s, the spectacle of lions and bears on the Wall of Death had really run its course. What had begun as the ultimate carnival thrill, a daredevil circling a wooden drum with a live predator pacing below, proved to be just too volatile. The noise, vibration, and fumes of the motordrome terrified the animals, and every performance was a potential disaster. Insurance companies were refusing coverage, and also state fairs began tightening animal safety laws, and audience themselves started to see it as kind of cruel. World War II had all but halted the circuit. Fuel rationing, enlistments, and a national focus on the war effort really shuttered most of these traveling shows up until the late 40s. By the end of World War II, the carnival world that had once celebrated danger, it was changing. And it's here that we really saw the decline of the use of animals in these specific kinds of shows. Also, the once roaring world of motordromes and the Wall of Death began to fade into memory. Television had arrived, bringing these kinds of thrill and spectacle directly to living rooms through programs like The Ed Sullivan Show and You Asked For It. For the first time, Americans no longer needed to leave home to experience, this circus type of performance. Audiences grew more sophisticated, and the sideshows and midway attractions that had once defined carnival life, they struggled to compete. And it's also true that the real value of carnivals, and especially amusement parks, came in the form of thrilling rides for those attending instead of just crazy shows for them to watch. By the 1980s, the Wall of Death found an unlikely second life, as antique motorcycles, and especially Indians, became prized collectibles. A new generation of enthusiasts rediscovered the spectacle that had once defined the carnival. A few determined showmen restored original motordromes or built new ones from scratch, bringing the act to modern audiences at motorcycle rallies like Daytona Bike Week and Sturgis, AMA Vintage Days, and gatherings of the Antique Motorcycle Club of America. In the United States, troops such as Don Daniels' California Hell Riders kept the tradition alive, proving that the appeal for this kind of thing had never faded totally. Across the Atlantic, the Wall of Death never really truly disappeared. Its legacy carried forward in Britain by riders like Alan Ford, Ken Fox, and then later Guy Martin, who in 2016 set a Guinness World Record by reaching 78 miles per hour on a purpose-built 123-foot diameter wall. Nearly a century after its birth, the Wall of Death lives on as really a living symbol of the appeal and fascination with speed and daring. There's something beautiful about the Wall of Death in its simplicity. Just a man or woman on a machine pushing against gravity itself. If you've ever even ridden a bicycle around a half pipe or on a pump track like I did recently with my kids, you know how intense this kind of thing is, and this is on a whole different level. In many ways, a century later, the Wall of Death still reminds people of why motorcycles are just so cool. It's that fine line between fun and danger that riders have to toe regardless of whether they just go out for a nice evening ride or a morning commute to work every day, or they ride or race professionally. Motorcycling is supposed to be about living on the edge a little bit. And so in this light, I think the Wall of Death makes a bit more sense. Deep down, every rider feels a little bit of the Wall of Death inside them, and that's part of the appeal. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this look at one of the lesser known parts of motorcycle history. Let us know if you have any experience with this phenomenon, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.